There are days when the world feels unbearably loud, not because of the traffic, or the people, or the notifications blinking on a screen, but because your own mind won't stop spinning. Thoughts collide like waves in a storm. Emotions rise without warning. And deep beneath it all, a quiet voice tries to whisper, but you can't quite hear it. Maybe you've felt it, that strange ache in your chest, when everything around you is moving. But you feel stuck. That moment late at night, when you're surrounded by comfort, but still feel restless. Or that sudden silence in a crowd, when something inside you longs for something more, not more achievements, not more possessions, but more presence, more peace. You're not alone in that feeling. Every soul, at some point in its journey, reaches a moment of stillness, a pause where it begins to ask deeper questions. Who am I beneath all these roles? What remains when the noise fades? Is it possible to feel truly at home, not in a place, but within myself today? We begin a journey, not one that will give you answers, but one that will soften the questions. A path made not of miles, but of moments, a movement inward, where the world outside slowly quiets and the world within begins to speak. We won't rush. This is not a race. It is an unfolding like petals opening to morning light, like mist rising from a quiet forest. Along this path, we'll walk with characters who are searching just like you, a young boy by a river, a traveler at the gates of a monastery, a mother holding too much but still smiling at dawn. We'll meet sages who don't speak in commands, but in parables, and we'll sit with stories that feel like dreams, stories that might, in the stillness of your listening, awaken something long forgotten. Let your heart be soft as we begin. There's no need to understand everything. Let the rhythm of the words carry you slow, steady, like breath. Let this be a space where your mind can rest, where your spirit can breathe. You are not here by accident. There is something inside you quiet, vast, and timeless that brought you here. And in these next moments, as we journey together through gentle tales and silent teachings, may you find not just stories, but reflections, not just ideas, but invitations. May you feel, more than anything else, that you are already enough, just as you are. Right now, welcome to the path home. He sat by the riverbank, barefoot, his toes brushing the soft edge of the muddy earth. The stream before him was calm, flowing not with urgency, but with a kind of quiet grace, as though it knew no destination, only movement. The child, no older than 10, wasn't sure what had drawn him there. He wasn't running from anything particular, yet something inside him ached not with pain, but with an emptiness he didn't know how to name. The village behind him bustled with the sound of midday, the clatter of pots, the distant call of a mother, the chatter of neighbors. But here, beside the water, the world slowed. The sky stretched above him in a blue so deep it felt like the whole universe was leaning down to listen. A heron stood a few paces away, still as stone, waiting for fish, and the boy wondered, how can one wait like that without fidgeting, without speaking, without trying? He dipped his hand into the cool stream. The ripples spread, then disappeared. And that was the moment, the exact breath when something shifted, not in the world, but in him. It was a strange stillness, not empty, but full, as though a doorway had opened inward. He didn't know the word for it yet, but what he felt was presence. Presence that rare, delicate gift of being wholly where you are, not thinking about what comes next, not remembering what went wrong, just sitting by a river with your hand in the water and nothing else needed. Later, much later in his life, when people would ask him when his journey began, his journey into silence, into stillness, into the deep forests of the self, he would not speak of books or teachers. He would speak of this moment, a child, a river, a still heron, a breath. At that time, of course, he had no guide. He didn't know that what he touched was the outer edge of meditation. He didn't know about mindfulness or breath work or any sacred teachings. But the river was a teacher, too, and it taught without words. Every time his hand moved, the water responded. Every time he was still, it became still again. And slowly, a question formed in him, not with language, but with sensation. If the water reflects stillness, what does my heart reflect? He didn't answer it. He just sat with it. Somewhere far away. A bell rang from the monastery on the hill. He had never entered that place. He had passed it once, walking with his grandfather, who had pointed at its ancient walls and said, "That's where the silent ones live." The boy had laughed. The idea of people who chose not to speak was funny to him then. But today, sitting beside the river, he wasn't laughing. He understood something of what it meant to be silent, not because you had nothing to say, but because the world had already said too much. As the sun began to move westward, his shadow grew long on the grass. He stood up, dusted his pants, and looked once more at the water. It was the same river, yet he had changed, even if only a little. Even if only for a while. That evening, at dinner, his mother asked him where he had gone. "Just the river," he said. She smiled, tired but kind. "You always go there when you're quiet." He nodded, but he didn't tell her why. He didn't have the words. Even now, all these years later, he still doesn't. Because the truth isn't something he can explain, only something he can return to. The river became his first temple, the place he returned to whenever the world became too loud. As he grew, he came to understand that we all have such places, though some forget. It may not be a river. It may be a tree, a rooftop, a windowsill at dawn. But each of us, somewhere in our journey, meets a moment that reminds us, you are not your noise. And when we meet that moment, however quiet, however brief a question stirs inside us, gentle and insistent, what if peace isn't somewhere else? What if it's been waiting inside me all along? That was the question. The boy began to live. He started returning to the river more often, not to play, not even to think, but to listen. Not to the birds or the wind, though they, too, were sacred. He listened to something else, a silence beneath all sound, a stillness that was not absence, but attention. And it was there, listening, that he noticed something beautiful and strange when he became quiet inside. The world outside seemed to respond. The breeze softened, the trees stilled, the birds, once so busy, flew lower, closer. It was as if the world had been waiting, waiting for him to finally be still enough to meet it. And so he learned not from books, not from teachers, but from the slow wisdom of the earth, that peace is not something you chase. It's something you allow. It's not a prize at the end of effort. But the result of surrender? Years would pass. He would go on to learn words like samadhi, vipassana, and mindfulness. He would travel to distant lands, sit with masters, listen to teachings both ancient and modern. But none of them ever reached as deep as the river had, because the river taught him not with answers, but with presence. Presence was enough. There was a time when silence was not frightening to her, a time when she could lie on her back in a field and listen to nothing but the rustling of grass, the occasional hum of an insect, the thrum of her own heartbeat. She had once known that kind of stillness. But that was long ago, before the world taught her to be afraid of quiet. Her name was Leah. She had grown up in a small town where the stars were still visible at night, where people paused in the street to speak with one another, and where children ran barefoot without fear. But now, Leah lived in a city that never slept, a place where noise was constant, the endless hum of engines, the sharp tone of messages arriving, the shallow conversations repeated over coffee and deadlines. The silence was gone. At first, she didn't notice the change. Life crept forward quickly: school, then work, then the layered demands of bills, obligations, relationships. Each year added something new to carry, but nothing was ever taken away. Her schedule filled, her inbox grew, her calendar colored itself with appointments and goals. And slowly, without meaning to, she stopped listening not to others, but to herself. Her reflection in the mirror began to feel unfamiliar. Her smile, practiced, her laughter, hollow. She performed her life with efficiency. But something essential was missing, something unspoken. Like a dream, you forget the moment you wake up. And then one day, it happened. She was walking home from work, beneath the wash of city lights. She passed a musician playing a flute on the corner, a simple tune, soft and winding, like smoke rising through twilight. And for just a second, time stopped. The music found something in her, something fragile and half-buried. Her breath caught. Tears welled up in her eyes without warning. She didn't understand why. It wasn't sorrow, exactly, nor joy. It was the ache of remembering something she didn't know she'd lost. That night, she lay awake. Her apartment, normally a safe cocoon of distractions: TV, phone, podcasts, felt suffocating in its quiet. She tried to sleep, but the silence pressed against her chest like a weight, and inside that silence, she heard something she hadn't heard in years. Her own voice. Not the voice she used for meetings or messages. Not the voice she used to explain or apologize. But a voice softer than whisper, older than thought. It didn't say anything clearly. It didn't shout. But its presence was undeniable, a warmth in her belly, a pulse in her ribs. She sat up, startled. She didn't know what to do with it. She turned on a lamp, drank water, scrolled through her phone, but the feeling wouldn't leave. It stayed, like a candle flickering in a long, dark room. She realized, with both awe and terror, that there was a part of her that had been waiting all along, waiting through years of noise, through the pretending and the pleasing, through the carefully constructed life that looked perfect from the outside, but felt hollow on the inside. This part of her, the quiet watcher, the still witness, had never gone. It had simply waited, buried beneath the clamor. And now, awakened by a simple melody, it stirred. The days that followed were strange. She began to see her life differently. The meetings felt more rushed, the conversations more surface. She noticed how often people avoided eye contact, how much time she spent numbing herself through screens, through snacks, through endless busy work. But with this awareness came discomfort. There was a shadow she couldn't ignore anymore. It followed her, not as a threat, but as a truth, a reminder of everything she hadn't felt, the disappointments she'd brushed aside, the griefs she never grieved, the anger swallowed for the sake of peace, the dreams abandoned for the illusion of security. She understood now the noise wasn't just around her, it was within her. And that noise, those voices of doubt, of fear, of judgment, had become so familiar. She had mistaken them for herself. This realization broke something open. For the first time, she questioned the identity she'd built. Was she really the successful professional, always smiling at work? Was she really the agreeable friend who never asked for anything? Was she the daughter who always nodded, even when she disagreed? Or was she someone else entirely, someone she had forgotten? The shadow within didn't answer in words. It simply showed her memories, moments when she'd silenced her intuition, times she'd chosen comfort over truth, times she'd stayed quiet when her heart screamed for honesty. It was painful to see, but it was also liberating, because in the shadow, there was clarity, not condemnation, but compassion. She saw that every choice she made, even the ones that led her away from herself, came from a desire to belong, to be loved, to be safe. And suddenly, instead of shame, she felt softness, a tender forgiveness blooming from within. That night, she did something she hadn't done since childhood. She sat on the floor, closed her eyes, placed her hand on her chest, and breathed. Not to fix anything, not to achieve anything, just to listen. With every inhale, she felt the weight of years begin to lift. With every exhale, she released a little more of the mask she had worn. And in that quiet, something unexpected happened. She smiled. Not the practiced smile she used in photos or meetings, but a real one. A smile that rose not from the lips, but from the soul. A smile of recognition, of reunion. The journey wasn't over. She knew that. There were still layers to peel back, truths to face, wounds to tend. But for the first time, she wasn't afraid. The shadow no longer felt like an enemy. It felt like a guide. It had shown her what she wasn't, so she could remember what she was, and what she was beneath the roles. The noise, the fear was light, a quiet, unwavering light. Morning arrived not with alarm, nor urgency, but with a hush, as though the world itself had paused. Just for a moment. To breathe. Elias sat alone on the edge of the hill, where the fog still clung to the grass, his coat wrapped around his knees, his hands cupped around a small clay mug of tea. He had come to the monastery 3 days ago, not in search of religion, but for something harder to name: space. Perhaps or silence, or maybe just a chance to remember who he was before everything had gotten so loud. It had taken years for the question to find him. The same years that had brought him success, movement, applause. And yet, in the quiet spaces between those triumphs, there had always been a whisper. Are you really here? He didn't understand it then, but he felt it now, not as an idea, but as a presence inside him. Something gentle, patient, and old. The monks had told him not to try too hard. Sit, breathe. That's enough, said the elder monk, gently folding his robe one morning. You don't have to chase the moment. The moment will meet you. At first. Elias laughed. He had built his life on chasing goals, deadlines, clarity. But here, in this place where time didn't move with the same demands, he found himself confronted by the unfamiliar rhythm of stillness. And in that stillness, something stirred. On the fourth morning, he sat beneath a tree. No instructions, no goals, just breath. He wasn't expecting anything. That was the rule, expect nothing. Notice everything. The breath came slowly, rising and falling like waves against a sleeping shore. His mind, as always, fluttered to things undone, things said, things feared. But he did not fight it. He simply watched, and then it happened. He became aware not of his thoughts, but of the space behind them. It was as if someone had turned down the volume, and in the silence that remained, he could hear something more honest, more real, not a voice, but a sensation, a fullness, a warmth, a deep knowing. It was the first true moment of awareness, and it wasn't dramatic. It didn't shake the earth. It didn't answer all his questions, but it changed everything. Because for the first time, he wasn't lost in thought. He wasn't reacting. He wasn't reaching. He was simply present. He felt the breath as it entered his nose, cool and sharp. He felt the breath leave warm and slow. He felt the earth beneath him, the tree at his back, the slow waking of the day. And in that presence, he met himself not as a role, not as a name, but as awareness itself. He had read about this before in books, in talks, in essays that tried to capture enlightenment in words. But now, he saw why words failed. Because this was not something that could be explained, only experienced. He stayed there for what felt like hours, though it may have been minutes. Time, once a master, had become irrelevant. And when he finally stood, something in him had softened. That evening, at the community meal, he looked around at the others, the silent monks, the new arrivals, the weathered travelers, and he saw them not as strangers, but as reflections, each carrying their own shadow, their own yearning, their own hidden light. He realized something important. Awareness doesn't mean escaping the world. It means entering it more deeply. He saw now how much of his life had been lived in reaction, reacting to emails, to expectations, to fears, to old wounds. He had moved through his days like a stone, skipping across water, touching everything, but never sinking in. But awareness was the opposite. It was not skipping. It was sinking slowly, gently, into each moment. The next morning, he returned to the tree. He sat again, breathed again. This time, when thoughts came, he smiled. He watched them like clouds drifting across a vast sky. He didn't chase them. He didn't fear them. He simply returned. Again and again. To the breath. The first breath of awareness had taught him this: you are not your thoughts. You are the space that holds them, the sky in which they move, the silence in which they arise. And that realization brought peace. Not the kind of peace that demands silence or perfection, but a peace that remains even as the storm comes. A peace that watches, welcomes, and waits. He began to notice things: the sound of a single leaf falling, the rhythm of footsteps on stone, the way sunlight moved across the table at noon. He noticed how his body held old tension in the shoulders, the jaw, the chest, and with each breath, he let it go. Not all at once, but gently, as one untangles a knot that has been tight for years. Sometimes, memories came, things he hadn't thought of in ages. A childhood moment, a mistake, a loss. He didn't push them away. He let them come. And then, like breath, let them go. It was a return, not to something new, but to something ancient within him. The breath, he realized, is the bridge between body and mind, between thought and being, between the self he performs and the self that watches. And the more he crossed that bridge, the more he felt at home. One evening, walking along the monastery's outer path, he paused to watch the sunset. The sky was a blaze of gold and indigo, and the wind moved like a hymn. A young monk stood beside him, hands folded. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Elias said softly. The monk smiled. "Yes, but the beauty is not just in the sky." Elias turned. "It's in the one who sees," the monk said, eyes calm. Elias nodded. He understood now. The first breath of awareness had not made the world different. It had made him different. More open, more tender, more here. And that, perhaps, was the beginning of all true awakening. The morning was quiet, but not empty. It was the kind of quiet that held life in its breath, not silence as absence, but silence as presence. The kind that drapes softly over the shoulders, warms the chest, and reminds you that being alive does not always mean being busy. Aaron walked slowly through the monastery garden, each step deliberate, each movement softened by awareness. The gravel crunched gently beneath her sandals, and the wind moved through the trees like a whispered memory. She wasn't thinking about yesterday or tomorrow. She wasn't rehearsing her words or measuring her progress. She was simply walking, and that was enough. It hadn't always been this way. There was a time when even her slowest moments were laced with tension, the itch to check a message, the reflex to plan, the buzz of mental clutter that never quite left her alone, even during rest. She was racing, but something had shifted. It began the moment she truly began to listen, not to others, but to herself, the quiet self, the watching self, the one that didn't demand or perform or apologize, but simply observed, with kindness, with space, with stillness. It was in this garden that she first felt it, the opening. A moment, brief but infinite, where she wasn't trying to change anything. She wasn't trying to be mindful. She simply was. A butterfly landed on her sleeve, and instead of reacting, she stayed still. Breath slowed, heart softened, and in that stillness, something in her heart began to bloom. It wasn't dramatic, no revelation, no sudden light, but it was real. She felt it like a soft bell, ringing within her chest, a vibration of presence, of attention, of coming home. This, the elder monk told her later, was mindfulness, not a tool, he said, sipping warm tea beside her. But a return, Aaron asked. Return to what the monk smiled. To yourself. To this moment. To the now that never leaves you. She had read about mindfulness before in books, in articles, in the flurry of modern wellness culture. But until that morning in the garden, she hadn't known it as a lived experience. She hadn't known that mindfulness was less about doing and more about allowing the breath to rise without control, allowing thoughts to pass without judgment, allowing herself to be here, exactly as she was, no improvement necessary, no perfection required, just presence. That afternoon, she sat beneath the Bodhi tree at the monastery's edge, notebook in hand, pen resting between thoughts. She had once written goals, plans, lists, but today, she wrote nothing. She simply watched the way the shadows moved, watched the way children's laughter from the village drifted like music over the walls, watched the mind as it wandered and then, gently, returned. She understood now what the monk had meant. Mindfulness isn't the absence of wandering. It's the return, the soft, patient return to now. Each time she noticed herself drifting into memory, into worry, into habit, she didn't scold or resist. She smiled and gently came back to the breath, back to the body, back to this precise moment, which asked for nothing but her presence. There was a kind of grace in that return, a sacred rhythm, like tide meeting shore. She began to see mindfulness not as something to master, but something to trust, like the sun that rises even when unseen, like the breath that continues even when forgotten. It was always there, waiting like an old friend for her to notice. And the more she noticed, the more the world began to change, not in its form, but in its texture. A sip of tea became a miracle, a passing breeze, a blessing. Even the ache in her legs after long sitting felt less like pain and more like a message. You are alive. You are here. Feel this. Mindfulness gave her permission to slow down, to do one thing at a time, to listen not just with ears, but with heart, to walk without rushing, to eat without distraction, to speak with intention. And slowly, gently, her relationship with life began to shift. She stopped rushing through her days like they were tasks to complete. She stopped measuring herself by what she accomplished. She began, instead, to measure her life in presence. How present was I with my morning tea? How present was I with the child who asked me a question? How present was I with myself? When no one was watching, these questions became her compass, and through them, she found something unexpected, a quiet joy, not the loud kind that bursts like fireworks, but the steady kind that hums like a well-tuned instrument. The joy of enough, the joy of noticing, the joy of being here, fully, without needing more. One evening, after a day of mindful labor sweeping leaves, folding linens, helping in the garden, she sat alone as the sun slipped behind the western ridge. She felt tired, but not drained, used, but not empty. She watched the sky soften into gold and then into twilight, and whispered quietly to herself, "This is it. This moment is my life." She wasn't trying to hold on to it. She wasn't afraid of it passing. She was simply grateful to have noticed it. And that she now understood, was the door of mindfulness. Not a portal to another place, but the doorway into this place, the real one, beneath the clutter of thought and habit. And once that door opens, even a crack, the light that pours through is enough to change everything, not because the world is different, but because you are. There are paths that are walked with purpose, and then there are those that seem to walk you. The mountain path was the second kind. It did not begin with a sign or a map. There was no announcement, no gate proclaiming its importance. It was simply there, a worn trail of stone and earth that began behind an old shrine wrapped in moss. To most, it looked like a forgotten path, swallowed by trees and shadows. But to Mina, it felt like an invitation. She had not planned to climb a mountain that day. In truth, she had not planned anything. She was between places, between a chapter that had ended and one that had not yet begun. Her job had vanished with a sudden email. Her relationship had ended with a silent goodbye. Her confidence had crumbled under the weight of what she couldn't control. So she wandered. Not far. Not fast. Just away from the noise. From the city. From the expectations. From the voice in her head that kept asking, "What now?" And then she found the trail. Or rather, the trail found her. It pulled her like a thread tugging at the edge of a tapestry. Not harshly, not urgently, just enough to make her pause, and then step again. The path was steep at times, narrow at others. Ferns brushed her legs, and roots threatened to catch her steps. But she didn't rush. Something told her not to. There was a stillness in the trees, not empty, but watchful. Birds called in the distance, and the wind spoke in hushed tones through the leaves. Every few minutes, Mina paused to breathe, to feel, to look not ahead, but around. It had been so long since she had done that. With every step, the city fell further behind, not just in distance, but in memory. Her thoughts began to slow. The questions quieted. She no longer needed to figure anything out. She just needed to walk. The mountain air was cool, scented with pine and earth. It wrapped around her like a shawl, neither warm nor cold, but comforting. The higher she climbed, the more the path seemed to cleanse her, not of dirt, but of noise, of clutter, of all the identities she had carried like armor. Halfway up, she reached a bend in the trail that overlooked the valley below. There, she sat on a stone and drank from her flask. Her hands trembled slightly, not from exhaustion, but release. And for the first time in weeks, maybe months, she wept. Not with anguish, not with fear, but with relief. The tears came as a letting go of plans, of roles, of the constant striving. And when they stopped, what remained was not emptiness, but space. From that space, she noticed a sound she had missed before, a bell, soft, distant, and regular. It rang through the trees like a call from another world, a monastery bell. She had heard rumors in the nearby village of a monastery hidden in the clouds, where time moved slower and people spoke less, but she had never seen it. Until now. The path curved onward. She rose, steadied by the rhythm of her steps and the echo of the bell. And as she climbed, something strange began to happen. The world grew quieter. Yes, but not in volume, in texture. The leaves looked more vibrant, the wind more purposeful, the sky more open. It was as if the climb itself was washing her vision, clearing the film of hurry and habit from her eyes. Eventually, the trees thinned. The path opened into a wide clearing, bathed in golden light, and there it stood, the monastery. Not grand, not imposing, just still, wood and stone, worn by time, wrapped in vines, smoke curling from a small chimney, a single monk sweeping the steps with slow, deliberate movements. Mina stopped. She didn't rush forward. She didn't call out. She simply stood there, watching, breathing, receiving the place with reverence. It felt less like arriving and more like returning, as if part of her had always known she would come. The monk looked up. Their eyes met. He didn't smile. He didn't speak. He simply nodded, once an acknowledgement beyond language, as if to say, "You've made it." She nodded back and crossed the threshold. Inside the courtyard, everything moved slowly. A novice filled bowls with rice. An old woman trimmed herbs. A cat slept beneath a fig tree. It was a world made of simplicity, of attention, of quiet tasks done with full presence. She felt no need to explain herself, no need to justify her arrival. The place did not ask, "Why are you here?" It simply asked, "Are you here?" And for the first time in what felt like lifetimes, she spent the next hours in silence, not enforced, but natural. Her body relaxed, her breath deepened, her thoughts scattered like birds in early light. She sat with a group of others around a table, sharing a meal with no words, only gestures of gratitude. And in that silence, she felt a strange fullness, as if every bite tasted of presence, as if every moment was sacred. Later, she found a small bench by the garden wall and closed her eyes. She had no plan for what came next, no itinerary, no ambition. She only knew this something had opened in her. A door she didn't know was closed, a softness she didn't know she had lost. And as the monastery bell rang once more deep, low, and kind, she placed her hand on her chest and whispered the only words that felt true, "I'm home." The courtyard was drenched in the soft amber of late afternoon. Leaves rustled gently overhead, their shadows dancing across the worn stone. And there, seated beneath the ancient fig tree, was Master On. He looked more like a gardener than a sage-robed simple, hands folded, eyes resting on a patch of moss, as if it were the most important scripture he had ever studied. There was no aura of authority, no air of distance, just presence. Mina hesitated. She had seen him from afar, heard whispers among the guests. That's him, the one who doesn't speak unless necessary, the one who listens like he's listening to your soul. But standing before him now, she felt oddly calm. Master On looked up, not startled, not expectant as if he had known she would come all along. "May I sit?" she asked, her voice unsure. He nodded once, a slow incline of the head that carried no judgment. She lowered herself to the stone beside him, knees brushing dust, back straight, but unsure. A long pause followed, long enough for her mind to begin its usual chatter. "Say something. Don't waste his time. Ask something wise. What are you even doing here?" But she said nothing, and neither did he. They sat. The wind moved. Time softened, and into that silence, something deeper arrived, not thought, but awareness. Finally, Mina spoke, I don't know what I'm looking for." Master An smiled, not with amusement, but with kindness. He plucked a small leaf from his robe and let it fall between them. "Then don't look," he said softly. "Be still, and let it find you." She frowned. "But I've spent years searching, reading, practicing. Nothing stays. I feel peaceful for a moment, and then it's gone. Like holding water in your hands." He said, "Yes." She nodded. "Exactly." He was quiet for a moment, then asked, "What if peace is not something to hold, but something to sit beside?" She blinked. "I don't understand." He turned slightly toward her. "Have you ever watched a bird come to feed?" "Yes. If you chase it, it flies." She nodded. "But if you sit long enough, still enough, it may come to you." Mina was quiet. Master An continued, "Peace is the same. It's not earned, not chased, only allowed." A breeze moved between them, lifting a strand of her hair. She tucked it behind her ear, unsure what to say. "I'm tired," she finally whispered, "of trying to be enough, of pretending to be okay. I came here because I didn't know where else to go. And now you are here," he said gently. "So, what is here?" She looked around. Stillness, trees, this bench, and inside you. She closed her eyes. Noise. He nodded. "Good. That is where we begin." She looked at him sharply. "But I thought the goal was silence." "No," he said. "The goal is honesty." She stared. Master An looked at the moss again. "Most people don't want truth. They want comfort dressed as truth. But you brought your noise. That is honest. And honesty is fertile ground. Tears welled unexpectedly. But I feel broken." He looked at her, deeply now. "No," he said. "You feel open." And something in her cracked. Not in pain, in relief. All these years she had tried to fix herself as if she were a machine out of order. But Master An didn't see parts. He saw presence. "You carry a heavy story," he said. "But you are not that story. I don't know how to let it go." "You don't need to," he said. "Let it soften. Let it breathe." She let the words fall inside her. Then, after a long silence, she asked the question that had been waiting inside her for years. "Who am I, if I'm not my thoughts?" My past Master An didn't answer at first. Instead, he reached down and picked up a smooth stone from the ground. "This," he said, holding it up, "was once jagged. Time made it smooth." He placed it gently in her palm. "Your edges are not flaws. They are the beginning of softness." She held the stone. It was cool, grounded, real. "Then what do I do now?" Master An smiled again. "Live, but more slowly. Feel your breath. Eat your food. Walk with your feet. Not your mind. That's it. That's everything." A bell rang in the distance. Evening had arrived. They sat a moment longer. Then, as she stood to go, Master An said one final thing. "When your mind begins to chase again, and it will, do not scold it. Smile. Bow to it. And return." To what he touched his chest. Return. To this. The small room smelled of cedar and tea leaves. Soft light spilled through the wooden slats of the paper window, casting gentle shadows that danced like whispers. On the low table sat a bowl plain, earthen, aged. It was cracked, not shattered, not broken beyond use, just one long, visible line that curved from rim to base like a river drawn in clay. Sora couldn't stop looking at it. She had come to the monastery in search of stillness. What she found instead were reflections, silent teachers in the form of rain, stone, breath. And now, this bowl. It had been handed to her by one of the novices during the morning tea ceremony. Carefully, with both hands, reverently, as if it were something sacred. And it was. Not because it was perfect, but because it wasn't. The crack had been mended, not hidden, but highlighted with a thread of gold that shimmered faintly in the morning light. "What is this?" she had asked. The novice had bowed gently. "Kintsugi, golden joinery," Master An explained later that day. When she finally gathered the courage to ask, he sat with her beneath the fig tree, the same place they had first spoken days before. The air was crisp, touched with a quiet that felt alive. "Kintsugi is the art of honoring the broken," he said, "of seeing beauty not in flawlessness, but in what has been restored." She traced the golden seam with her eyes. "But isn't the bowl weaker now?" "No," he said. "It is stronger and more honest." She was quiet for a moment. Then, almost reluctantly, "I've always tried to hide my cracks." Master An nodded slowly. "Most people do." The wind moved through the leaves above them. Sora lowered her eyes. "Sometimes I feel like everything in me has fractured my thoughts, my relationships, my past, like no part of me is whole." "Then you are ready," he said. "Ready for what? To begin." She looked up. "Haven't I already begun?" Master An smiled. "You've arrived. But beginning means meeting yourself where you are, not where you think you should be." Her breath caught. That night, alone in her room, she held the cracked bowl again. She thought of all the places in herself she had tried to hide, the mistakes, the regrets, the things she had lost, the things she never dared to want. She thought of the versions of herself she had buried under masks: the good daughter, the overachiever, the one who never asked for help. Each mask had been protection, each crack, a story. And suddenly, she saw herself not as a failure, but as a bowl, worn by life, touched by time, and still, holding, still whole. Because wholeness was not the absence of damage. It was the willingness to be seen anyway. The following day, she asked Master An how the bowl had been repaired. He brought her to the small workshop behind the main hall. Inside were shelves of chipped teacups, fractured plates, and broken ceramics in all stages of mending. The process was slow, intentional, each fragment cleaned, each seam lined with gold lacquer, each moment a meditation. "You must hold the piece with love," the artisan monk said, "not as something ruined, but as something waiting to be honored." Sora stayed all day. She didn't speak much. She watched, listened, held a broken teacup in her palm and felt its story. That night, she wrote in her journal, "What if I could hold myself the same way, not as a problem to fix, but as something precious waiting to be seen?" It was a question that changed everything. She began to sit longer, in meditation, not trying to silence her thoughts, but to befriend them. She began to walk slower, noticing the rhythm of her steps. She began to eat with more attention, tasting each bite like a blessing. And she began to speak more gently to herself, especially in moments of pain. When old memories arose, she didn't push them down. She breathed. When self-judgment crept in, she didn't fight. She noticed. And slowly, the golden seams within her began to glow. Not literally, but in feeling. There was a new kindness in her chest. A softness that hadn't been there before. A sense of space, the space to feel, to fall, to rise, to try again. She thought of all the people in her life who also carried cracks. Friends who smiled through heartbreak. Family who hid their shame behind strength. Strangers who carried burdens unseen. And her heart opened. We are all bowls, she realized. Cracked, repaired, beautiful. One evening, just before dusk, she returned to the workshop. The artisan monk handed her a small box. Inside was the bowl, the same one she had first held, now fully mended. The gold even brighter than before. For you, he said, to remember. She touched the seam, tears brimming. Thank you. He bowed. Thank yourself. You were the one willing to see. Back in her room, she placed the bowl on her window ledge. It caught the last light of day, glowing quietly. And in that light, she saw not just a bowl, she saw herself, whole. Not because nothing had ever been broken, but because she had learned to love what had. The stream behind the monastery was small, almost hidden. It didn't roar or crash like mountain rivers. It moved gently, weaving between moss-covered stones and old tree roots, whispering its song in tones too soft to command attention. And yet, day after day, Errol found himself returning to it. There was something about the way the water moved unhurried, unhindered. It didn't argue with obstacles. It didn't resist the shape of the earth. It simply went. He would sit on a smooth rock near the bend, knees drawn close, chin resting on folded arms, and watch. The first few times, he came to escape from the rigid silence of the monastery, from the weight of self-reflection, from the shame he wasn't ready to name. But over time, he realized he wasn't escaping. He was listening to the stream, to himself, to something quieter than thought, but more truthful than words. He had always admired strength, the kind that held firm, stood tall, pushed forward. He had spent most of his life becoming that kind of strong, holding it together, smiling through pain, carrying the weight. But here, beside this stream, he began to wonder, what if strength could mean something else? Because the water didn't push. It yielded. It curved. It adapted. It allowed. And still, it reached the ocean. One morning, he asked Master An about it. They walked together in silence to the stream. The master sat beside him, looking at the flow. Water, Errol began. It doesn't fight. No. Master An agreed. But it doesn't stop either. No. So, is yielding weakness? Master An smiled faintly. Only when we believe force is the only path. He picked up a small stone and placed it gently in the stream. The water parted, curved, embraced the stone, and continued. You see, the master said. It did not resist. It danced. Errol stared at the spot. But in the world I come from, if you yield, you lose. If you bend, you break. Master An said nothing, just picked up a dry branch nearby and snapped it in two. Hard, he said, and brittle. Then he bent a reed of grass all the way to the ground and let go. It swayed back up, untouched, soft, he said, and enduring. Errol looked down. I've spent so long holding everything in, he whispered, trying not to break. but I feel like I'm drowning." Master On touched the water. "Then become the stream." Errol frowned. "How start with the breath?" They closed their eyes, breathed. And for the first time in a long while, Errol didn't try to control the breath. He let it move him, like the current moved a leaf. Inhale, exhale, no effort, no resistance, just presence. He stayed by the stream long after the master had gone. He thought about the arguments. He used to have the ones where he always needed the last word. He remembered the guilt he carried, and how hard he worked to pretend he didn't. He thought about how often he had drowned in his own expectations of being strong, being successful, being right. The stream held none of that, and still, it moved. He reached into the water, letting it run through his fingers. What if strength was not in resisting, but in receiving, not in being unmoved, but in being moved without losing yourself over the following days? Errol practiced yielding, not in defeat, but in trust. When he walked, he slowed, letting the path shape his pace, not his urgency. When he listened, he stopped rehearsing his reply. He just listened. And when pain rose, the kind he had kept buried in the back chambers of his mind, he didn't tighten. He didn't run. He breathed, let it come, let it pass, like water. One evening, it rained. He sat under the monastery's eaves, watching the droplets gather in puddles, tracing little rivers down the stone. The world smelled like wet leaves and cleansing. He remembered how he used to dread rain. It meant delay, disruption, detours. Now, it meant release. Nature didn't argue with change. It adapted. So could he. He thought of the people he had hurt not out of cruelty, but out of armor. The words he had thrown like stones. The silence he had used like walls. Yielding didn't mean excusing, but it meant forgiving first himself, then others. A few days later, he returned to the stream with a single stone in his pocket. It was smooth worn by water, found on the trail. He whispered a quiet prayer, not one of perfection, but of openness. Then he placed the stone in the stream, watched the water wrap around it, welcoming it into the flow. And in that moment, he understood. Life does not need you to push. It invites you to join. The rake made a sound like soft brushing silk, gentle, rhythmic, barely noticeable unless one was listening. And Koji was listening. Each stroke of the rake across the gravel path echoed a breath. In, out, pull, rest. Again. He had been assigned the task of sweeping the courtyard that morning. Just after the bell rang for silent work. It seemed simple, perhaps even mundane. But here at the monastery, even the smallest act held depth. At first, Koji resented it. He had come for insight, not errands. He had come to understand the mind, not clean the earth. But the monk who handed him the rake said only this: clean the path, and you may see your own. So Koji began half-heartedly at first, distracted by thought. Why am I here? What does this have to do with awakening? Shouldn't I be meditating, reading, studying? But the rake required attention. If he dragged too hard, he damaged the moss. If he moved too fast, the leaves scattered back. If he didn't watch where he stepped, his footprints marred the freshly cleared lines. So slowly, without meaning, Koji began to notice. the way the leaves gathered in small spirals, the soft curve of the stone underfoot, the coolness of the morning air against his skin, the way his breath matched the rhythm of the movement. He stopped thinking about how long it would take. He stopped counting how many leaves remained. He simply raked, and the courtyard, like his mind, slowly began to clear. Each leaf was a thought fallen, no longer needed, waiting to be seen. Each stroke of the rake, a letting go. As the hours passed, something shifted. The task became no longer about cleaning the ground, but about touching life. He began to feel a strange joy, not the kind that bursts, but the kind that hums quietly beneath the surface. A joy that said, "You are here. You are part of this. This moment matters." Midday came. The sun filtered through the trees in soft beams. The courtyard glowed, not with grandeur, but with clarity. Koji stepped back and looked at his work. A simple space, clean, quiet, inviting, and he felt that same clarity in his chest, not triumph, not pride, but peace. Later, during the tea circle, he shared his experience with Master An. The elder monk nodded. "Now you understand?" Koji asked. "Understand what that meditation," he said, "is not what we do instead of life. It is how we meet it." Koji blinked. The monk continued. "Sweeping is not a distraction from practice. It is practice, just as breathing is, just as walking is. The sacred is not found by escaping the ordinary. It is found by paying attention to it." Koji sat with those words. He thought of all the times he had rushed through tasks, thinking only of the next thing, of how to finish faster, and he saw now how much of life he had missed. "I always thought wisdom was in answers," Koji said, "but now I think it might be in presence." Master An smiled. "The leaf does not ask what it means to fall. It simply falls, and in falling, it teaches us about letting go." That afternoon, Koji returned to the courtyard, not because he was assigned, but because he wanted to. This time, he moved even slower. He noticed the way the breeze helped, the way the rake glided more smoothly when he relaxed, the way the silence around him echoed the silence within. And when the work was done, he didn't rush to the next thing. He stood, watched, breathed. The courtyard was clean again, but more importantly, he was clear. Not perfect, not enlightened, but awake. And that, he realized, was enough. The first drop fell like a whisper on his shoulder, cool, almost unnoticed. Then another, and another. Soon, the sky above the monastery darkened, and the rain came in full steady, soft and enveloping. Tao didn't run for cover. He stood in the open courtyard, eyes closed, arms by his side. As the rain soaked through his robe and into his skin, the earth around him darkened with moisture, the scent of wet stone and moss rising like incense. He had always loved the rain, not for its gloom, but for its honesty. Rain never pretended. It never waited for permission. It simply arrived, with all its weight and grace, washing everything it touched. And today, he needed to be washed, not just his body, but the ache he carried silent, old, unfinished. It had been years since Tao let himself remember, really remember. He had spent most of his adult life burying the past beneath accomplishments, responsibilities, and distractions. But here, in the stillness of the monastery, with no noise to drown it out, the memories returned, not all at once, not like a flood, more like mist rising after rain, gentle, inevitable, impossible to ignore. He saw his mother's face, lined with quiet sorrow. Her hands, always working, always trembling just slightly. He remembered the silence in their small apartment, the smell of burnt rice, the way she would hum the same melody over and over, as if trying to hold something together with a tune. He remembered the shouting behind closed doors, his father's voice loud, then quiet, then gone. And he remembered himself small, curled in a corner, pretending not to hear, pretending not to feel. Tao had never cried about it. Not when he left home. Not when he buried her. Not even when he stood alone at her funeral, with no one to hold his grief. But now, in the rain, something broke. And this time, he let it. The tears came hot and full, mixing with the rain, indistinguishable from the sky's own sorrow. He didn't try to stop them, didn't shame them. He simply let them fall. Each tear carried a memory, each drop, a release. He remembered the way she used to brush his hair, her fingers gentle even when her eyes were tired. He remembered the time she stitched his torn shirt while humming a lullaby, even though they had no thread to spare. He remembered the way she smiled softly, sadly, whenever he brought home good grades, as if pride and regret lived in the same breath. And with each memory, something within Tao softened. The pain did not vanish, but it changed shape. It became less like a wound and more like a scar, still there, still tender, but no longer bleeding. He sat on the wet stone, letting the rain wrap around him like a cloak. The world was quiet except for the gentle rhythm of falling water and the distant call of a bird sheltering in the trees. He remembered a question Master An had once asked. What do you carry that was never yours to hold at the time? Tao didn't know how to answer. Now he did. He carried guilt. Guilt for not saving her. Guilt for leaving. Guilt for not being enough. But he was a child. A child cannot carry the weight of another's sorrow. A child cannot fix what the world broke. He whispered to the rain, "It wasn't mine." And the sky responded with a gentle gust, as if affirming his truth. For the first time, he allowed himself to love her, not through obligation, but through memory, to see her not as someone who failed, but as someone who tried, with everything she had. And he allowed himself to grieve, not just her death, but the childhood he never got to live. That grief, though sharp, was also freeing, because in naming it, in feeling it fully, he was no longer its prisoner. He rose slowly, drenched but lighter. The rain had slowed. The courtyard shimmered. And within him, a quiet promise formed. I will live with gentleness for her, and for the boy I once was. As he stepped inside to dry, Tao knew this moment would return. Grief, like rain, never truly disappears. But now, he no longer feared it, because he knew how to stand in it, and how to let it fall. The sun had not yet fully risen when Jorn stepped quietly into the reed fields. Dew clung to the tips of each blade, the entire landscape draped in a silver hush. Around him, the tall grasses swayed with the first sighs of morning breeze, a silent ballet that stretched across the plain, breathing as one. In the distance, a crane took flight, its wings beating slowly, rhythmically, as if in tune with some greater stillness. It was to this place wild, humble, untouched that Joran returned each morning. He did not come with expectations. He brought no journal, no cushion, no ritual, only breath and presence. In his earliest visits, the reed fields were a refuge, a place to hide. They stood tall like a wall, and he slipped between them to escape, to disappear. But over time, they became something else, a teacher, a mirror, a friend. He had not always been a man who listened. Most of his life had been spent pushing for answers, for achievement, for validation. He knew how to strive, but he did not know how to be, until the pain of striving began to outweigh the rewards. It began with small things, a shortness of breath in the middle of meetings, a hollow ache in his chest as he climbed the ladder of success, a growing distance from the people who once mattered most. And then came the silence, the one he could no longer ignore. It spoke to him in the night, in moments between moments, in the look he caught in his own reflection. Eyes weary, lost, he left everything, not out of bravery, but necessity. And the reed fields welcomed him. At first, they overwhelmed him. The sheer silence, the absence of clocks, the way his thoughts screamed when there was nothing to distract them. He tried to meditate, as he had read in books, but his mind would not stay still. Memories came sharp, uninvited, regrets, heavy and unforgiving. But he kept returning, each day. He took one more step into the field. Each day, he stayed one breath longer, and slowly, the noise began to soften. It did not vanish, not completely, but it shifted, became less like static, more like wind, something that passed through him, not something he had to hold. He began to notice the reeds more closely, the way they bent in the wind but did not break, the way they grew together, not in isolation, but in community, their roots intertwined beneath the soil, silent companions. And he began to wonder, what if I could live like this, soft, present, interconnected? He began a new kind of meditation, not on a cushion, but in motion. He walked barefoot through the reeds, slowly, allowing his breath to guide each step. He let his fingers graze the blades as he passed, each touch a reminder. You are here. You are alive. You are enough. One morning, he found a small clearing, a patch where the reeds parted and the sky poured in. There, he sat. No thoughts, no goal, just sitting. And as he did, something remarkable happened. He began to feel again, not just emotions, but sensations, the warmth of the sun on his skin, the coolness of the earth beneath him, the subtle pulse of his heartbeat, not rushing, not heavy, just there, in that moment. He did not need to be healed. He did not need to understand. He only needed to be. He remembered a story the monks had told of an old farmer who once asked a master how to find enlightenment. The master said only this: when walking, just walk. When eating, just eat. When grieving, just grieve. Simple, profound, true. Joran had spent so long trying to escape his pain that he had missed its wisdom. In the stillness, the pain returned, but now it spoke. It spoke of longing, of loneliness, of a boy who had never been taught how to rest, a boy who was always praised for being strong, never for being soft. Joran wept not with despair, but with recognition. He saw that boy now, not as weakness, but as a beginning. The reeds swayed around him, and he swayed with them, breathing, listening, trusting. The next day, he brought a small bowl of tea into the field. He did not drink quickly. He watched the steam rise first, watched the sun glint off the surface, watched his own hands that had once gripped so tightly, now hold with gentleness. He drank slowly, each sip an act of presence. He began to bow, not in ritual, but in gratitude, to the wind, to the earth, to the pain, to himself. One afternoon, he noticed a reed bent sharply, nearly broken. Instinctively, he reached down to lift it, but as he did, he saw something astonishing. The reed was not dying. It had bent to the ground, yes, but from its base, a new shoot had emerged stronger, straighter, not in spite of the bending, he realized, but because of it. And suddenly, he understood something he had never dared to believe. His breaking had made space for something new. He had not come to the reeds to be fixed. He had come to remember that life moves in seasons, that bending is not failure, that softness is strength, and that the body, like the breath, like the reed, always knows how to return. The sun dipped low that evening, casting the field in a golden hush. Joren stood slowly, brushing the earth from his palms. He did not feel healed, but he felt real, connected, present. He walked back through the swaying green, each step a prayer, each breath a homecoming. And in his heart, he carried a single truth. The way back is not through force, but through surrender, not by becoming someone else, but by fully becoming who you already are. The house stood the same as it had 20 years ago, worn wooden siding, sagging porch steps, the wind chime that clinked against the rusted gutter. But for all its sameness, it felt like stepping into a place he had never truly known. Callum stood by the gate, his hand resting on the peeling paint, watching the curtain in the front window shift slightly. He had not seen his father since the day he left, not after the final argument, not after the silence that followed, not after his mother passed and the letter arrived with only 4 words. He's not doing well. Now. Decades of resentment sat heavy in his chest, and yet his feet moved forward. Each step toward the porch felt like walking upstream. The air was thick, not with heat, but with history, with the unspoken, the unrepaired. The door opened before he could knock, and there he was, older, smaller. His once broad shoulders had sunk. The fire in his eyes had become embers, but the silence, the weight of it, still lingered between them. "Callum," his father said, voice rough, unsure. "Hi," was all he could manage. They stood there, 2 men who shared blood but had forgotten how to speak. Inside, the house was dim, quiet. Dust clung to the windowsills. Photos hung crooked on the walls, memories trapped behind glass. They sat at the table, the same one where so many fights had been fought. Callum remembered the exact spot on the wood where he had once slammed his hand and walked out, vowing never to return. Now he stared at that spot, softened by time, worn smooth. "I wasn't sure you'd come," his father said. "I wasn't sure I would either," Callum replied. A long silence, but not hostile, more like a field left fallow. "Waiting?" "I'm not good with words," his father said at last. Callum looked at him. "I know." Another pause. His father's eyes, once sharp and commanding, were now watery, hesitant. "I did things wrong," he said quietly, held things too tight, let anger speak too often, didn't know how to be a father, not the way you needed. Callum's throat tightened. I needed something, anything, a kind word, a listening ear, but all I got was correction. His father nodded slowly, guilt clear but without defense. I thought being strong meant never bending. I thought love was discipline. And I thought leaving would fix it. Callum said, voice cracking. But I carried you with me anyway in my anger, my fear, in how I treated people who tried to love me. The silence that followed was different now, full of shared pain. Callum stood, unable to sit still. He walked to the window, looking out at the old oak tree he had once climbed as a boy. I used to wish you'd come out and watch me. He said, but you never did. I was watching, his father said, softly, through the window. I didn't know how to join you. Tears rose. Why didn't you say that back then I didn't have the language? His father said, only the walls. Callum turned, and now his father looked up. Now, I have regret and time. That was the moment the room shifted. Callum didn't run from the pain anymore. He walked toward it. He sat beside his father, not as a son needing approval, but as a man willing to see. They talked for hours, not all at once, but in slow ripples, a memory here, a wound there. Each shared story removed a brick from the wall that had stood between them. Callum spoke of how he had grown the therapy, the silence retreats, the meditation that taught him not just to breathe, but to forgive. His father listened. Then he told stories Callum had never heard about his own father. A man harder than stone, and how he swore he'd be different, only to realize he didn't know how. I thought being quiet would protect you from me, he said, but all it did was leave you alone. They didn't apologize with perfect words. They apologized with presence, with listening, with tears that came unannounced and were allowed to stay. That night, Callum didn't sleep in the guest room. He sat outside on the porch beside his father, wrapped in blankets, sipping tea that had gone lukewarm. The stars hung above like silent witnesses. I still don't know how to say things right, his father murmured. You just did, Callum replied. In the quiet, Callum reached over and placed a hand gently over his father's, a gesture they'd never shared before. It was enough. The healing did not erase the past, but it rewrote the future. They would talk again over calls, letters, shared moments. It would take time, but the door had been opened, and for the first time in years, Callum no longer carried the weight of bitterness. He carried something softer, something closer to love. The wind carried the scent of earth and something faintly sweet, the last flowers of the season, clinging to their stems with quiet resilience. Lena sat on the bench just outside the monastery's vegetable garden, watching the monks as they worked in silence, their movements slow, deliberate, unhurried. There was something reverent in how they moved, how they lifted weeds, how they watered the soil, how they held even the smallest sprout with the same attention they might offer a sacred relic. It was not productivity that guided them, but presence. She had never known that kind of slowness. Her life had been built on urgency, rushing through deadlines, managing people, climbing the invisible ladder that always promised peace, just one step higher. But the higher she went, the more distant peace became. It wasn't until her body collapsed, literally, in a boardroom, in front of her team, that she realized something was wrong. Not just physically, but spiritually. She had come to the monastery not to find God or even enlightenment. She had come to remember how to breathe. And now, weeks into her stay, something unfamiliar had begun to grow within her, a flicker of tenderness, a gentle warmth that she hadn't invited, but which stayed anyway. It came most often during the small moments. The quiet blessing of morning light on her pillow, the feel of warm soup in her hands on cool evenings, the kindness in a novice's eyes when offering her tea, and, increasingly, it came in the form of gratitude, not the kind she had been taught the obligatory thanks at dinner tables or after favors, but a raw, quiet acknowledgement of aliveness. She didn't chase it. It arrived like a soft tide, washing over her at the edges. One morning, during walking meditation, she paused beneath a plum tree and found herself whispering, "Thank you." There was no one around, no one to receive the words. And that was the point. The thanks weren't for someone, they were for life itself, for breath, for still being here. Lena had spent so many years measuring herself against what she hadn't achieved, what she hadn't healed, what she hadn't become. But now, she was beginning to see the quiet miracle of what already was. She remembered something Master An had said during a Dharma talk. Gratitude is not an emotion. It's a form of attention. Where we place our attention, we place our heart. And slowly, she began placing her attention differently. She noticed the warmth in her chest after laughter. She paused longer when eating, savoring even simple rice with reverence. She looked people in the eye, really looked, not to evaluate, but to connect. One afternoon, she was assigned to clean the meditation hall, a task that had once annoyed her, a reminder of how much she still owed the world. But this time, she approached it with intention. She knelt with a soft cloth, wiping the wooden floors gently, almost lovingly. She touched each cushion, arranging them with care. She lit incense not as a ritual, but as a thank you to the space, to the silence, to herself for showing up. By the end, tears welled, not of sadness, but of something deeper, a kind of reverence she hadn't known she needed. That night, she journaled for the first time in weeks, but this time, instead of writing questions or reflections, she simply wrote a list of things she was grateful for. The warmth of tea, the rustle of leaves, the quiet smile of a passing monk, her breath, the fact that her body, though once pushed too far, was still healing, still holding her. The list grew, not in grandeur, but in grace. And as she wrote, she realized gratitude wasn't just a feeling, it was medicine. It stitched together the parts of her that shame had torn apart. It gave voice to the beauty she had been too busy to notice. It made her pain feel less like punishment and more like passage. One morning, she returned to the bench by the garden and sat with Master An. She shared some of what she was feeling. He listened, nodding slowly. Then he said, "A grateful heart is a strong heart, not because it avoids pain, but because it sees pain and beauty at once, and chooses to bow to both." She looked at her hands, worn but steady. I used to think healing would look like escaping the hard parts. And now, I think healing is allowing them, but also allowing joy, not waiting for one to finish before beginning the other. He smiled. That is wisdom. They sat for a long time, saying nothing, just breathing. Later that evening, Lena sat beneath the same plum tree where she had whispered thanks days ago. She placed her hand over her heart, and instead of thinking about who she had been or who she might become, she simply said, "Thank you," to the body that had carried her, to the spirit that had endured, to the moments of stillness that had taught her to see. And she knew then, deeply and completely, that this quiet gratitude was not the end of her healing. It was the beginning. The wind carried the scent of pine and distant rain as Jun made his way through the lower trail behind the monastery. It was a winding path bordered by ferns and low-hanging branches, barely wide enough for one person, but enough to feel held. He walked not to arrive anywhere, but to remember that he was part of something larger. A leaf fell from a nearby tree, twirling slowly through the air. It landed softly on the path before him. Jun paused. He crouched and picked up the leaf. Its edges were curled, browned by time, but its center still held hints of green. He turned it in his fingers. A line surfaced in his memory, something he had heard in a Dharma talk weeks before. This leaf is not just a leaf. It is sun. It is cloud. It is soil. Without these, it could not be. At the time, it sounded poetic. Now, it felt like truth. He stood again and continued walking, leaf in hand. His thoughts turned to a time not long ago when he felt profoundly alone, surrounded by people, yet isolated inside. A successful career, full calendar, and yet something hollow. He wore independence like armor, thinking it would protect him. But in truth, it had become a prison. At the monastery, the first thing they taught wasn't solitude. It was interbeing. The simple, powerful insight that nothing exists alone, that every breath is shared, every step is supported, that the flower cannot bloom without the bee, nor the bee without the flower, that we are all woven into a fabric far older and vaster than we can see. At first, Jun resisted it. It felt vulnerable, the idea that he needed others, that his strength came not from separateness, but from connection. But as the days passed, the quiet teachings of the forest, the kitchen, the shared silence of meditation began to soften him. He began to see the threads. In the tea, he drank the farmer who picked the leaves, the rain that nourished them, the sun that warmed them. In the robe, he wore the hands who stitched it, the sheep whose wool became thread. In his own body, the breath passed down through generations, the DNA that whispered stories of ancestors long gone. Nothing was separate, not truly. Even his pain, it wasn't his alone. It was shaped by a culture, by family, by inherited beliefs, by countless moments of disconnection and misunderstanding. And so too, his healing could be shared. He remembered helping in the kitchen one morning, one monk chopping vegetables, another washing rice, a novice lighting incense nearby. No words spoken, but in the quiet dance of shared action, he felt something break open. He didn't need to prove anything. He didn't need to be strong alone. He simply needed to be part. Jun came to a small clearing where the trees opened to sky. He sat down on the damp earth and looked up. The clouds moved slowly. He thought of the people who had loved him imperfectly, but earnestly. Friends who stayed through his silences. A teacher who once told him, "You're allowed to lean." A stranger who smiled when he needed it most. He thought of all the invisible kindnesses he had received, the ones he had never noticed. And for the first time, he allowed himself to feel it fully. He belonged, not because he had earned it, but because existence itself is a network of belonging. He whispered, "Thank you," not to anyone in particular, but to the web of life that held him, to the earth beneath him, to the parents who gave him form, to the strangers who unknowingly shaped his days, to the leaf in his hand, once tree, now soil to be. Later that evening, during the closing bell, the teacher recited a line of Thich Nhat Hanh, "You are me, and I am you." Isn't it obvious that we inter-are? Jun smiled. It was obvious now. He looked around the meditation hall, people breathing, sitting, being, not alone, never alone, just temporarily forgetting. And now, remembering. The tea room was small, almost bare. A single scroll hung on the wall, a calligraphy stroke shaped like a wave, dancing midair. In the center of the room, a low table. On it, a clay teapot, 2 cups, steam curled upward, disappearing into silence. Kai sat on the woven mat across from Master Ryo. Outside, snow fell in slow silence, blanketing the monastery courtyard. Inside, time seemed to move even slower. Master Ryo moved with the grace of water, no excess, no waste, every gesture a poem. He poured the tea without words, his hands old but steady. The tea was green, fragrant, alive. Kai lifted his cup. The master did not. He looked at Kai, not sternly, but with a gentle pause. Kai stopped, lowered the cup, waited. Master Ryo picked up his own cup, held it in both hands, and bowed to it slightly. Then, slowly, he brought it to his lips. Kai followed. The first sip was warmth, then earth, then light. He swallowed, then exhaled. "Good," the master asked, eyes smiling. Kai nodded. "Very." Ryo nodded once. "Then stop there." Kai blinked. "Stop drinking. Stop seeking more." Kai frowned. "But isn't there more to the cup?" "Yes," Ryo said, "but not more to need." Kai looked down. He had always rushed, drunk quickly, lived quickly, believed that satisfaction lay in the next taste, the next goal, the next achievement. Master Ryo took another sip, then set the cup down. Silence stretched between them like a breath held long. "You drink tea," Ryo said quietly, as if chasing something. "But tea is not a chase. It is an invitation. Invitation to what Kai asked. To now." Kai sat with that. He had come to the monastery seeking clarity, but what he had received so far were riddles, simple tasks. And now, tea. But something in this moment, something was different. Ryo spoke again. "You do not see the tea. You see only what it will give you." Kai stared into his cup. He saw heat, steam, color, the reflection of his own face. "I don't understand," he whispered. The master smiled. "Good." Then he reached forward and refilled Kai's cup, one slow stream, one steady hand. "Let me ask you," Ryo said. "Where is the path?" Kai looked at him. "Which path?" "The path of peace," Kai thought. In the teachings in mindfulness, in letting go. The master shook his head. In this cup, Kai stared. Peace, Rio said, is not found, it is noticed. It is here or nowhere. The snow outside thickened, cloaking the world in white silence. Kai took another sip, this time slower. He felt the tea touch his tongue, felt it slide down his throat, felt the warmth spreading. He exhaled, and for a brief moment, there was no seeking, no question, no hurry, just breath, just presence, just tea. Ryo nodded. Now you begin. In a village nestled at the foot of mist-clad mountains lived a woodcutter named Sifu. Every day at dawn, he would shoulder his axe and walk the winding forest path to find the perfect log. His life was simple chop, carry, sell, rest, then repeat. In the steady rhythm of his work, there was peace. Yet, something in him felt unsettled, as if a quieter truth lay hidden somewhere between the tree trunks. One morning, when the sun had painted gold over the forest floor, Seifu came upon a grove unlike any he'd seen. At its heart stood an ancient tree, massive, with roots that burrowed like silent questions, and branches that rose like veiled prayers. Moss hung from its limbs, and in its bark, centuries seemed etched into its silence. Seifu felt his axe tremble in his hand, as if refusing its purpose. He realized, with sudden clarity, that this tree was not meant to fall. He stepped back and, for the first time in years, just listened. A hush settled over him, deeper than any dawn he'd known. In that hush, he heard not the bird call, not the babbling stream, but something older, an echo of stillness that ran through his bones. He knelt, pressing his palm to the tree's trunk, feeling its slow pulse life without haste. For days, he returned. Each visit, he sat beneath the canopy, allowing the tree's stillness to sink into him. He chopped nothing, carried nothing. He simply listened, soaked in the cool shade, watched the sunlight play on the bark, and in that listening, something within him began to soften. He remembered his father, a man who taught him strength through insistence, and his mother, who prayed that he would learn gentleness before it was too late. In the grove, those voices found echo, no judgment, no instruction, just presence. One afternoon, a traveler came through the forest, a monk, by his robes and calm gait. The monk paused when he saw Seifu, sitting motionless like the ancient tree himself. "Why do you stop the work you were born to do?" the monk asked gently. Seifu stood. He looked at the monk, then at the tree. "I feel something I have not felt in years." "Then feel it," the monk replied. "I came to cut wood. Now I cannot." He shook his head, voice low. "What am I without my axe?" The monk smiled. "Perhaps you are not losing. Perhaps you are finding." Seifu frowned. "Finding what stillness," said the monk, "and stillness is the source of all action." He sat beside Seifu, waiting. Seifu felt tears. He brushed them away. "I thought activity was strength." "Strength," the monk said, "comes not from constant motion, but from knowing where to stand still." Seifu let the words sink as he returned to the tree. He sat, eyes closed, and felt the slow thrum of life. Tree, earth, sun, self. Days turned to weeks. Seifu began to change. He no longer rose at dawn to chop. He rose to watch. At noon, he carried water to the base of the tree. At dusk, He swept leaves from around its roots. He never spoke of forgetfulness or surrender. He spoke only with soft movement. Occasionally, villagers came to ask why he no longer chopped. He would respond with a gentle smile, "I am learning to listen." No one understood. Most thought him lazy. A few thought he'd gone mad. But the ancient tree did not judge. It continued to offer its quiet presence, a teacher in green and bark. One night, the monk returned. He found Sefu sleeping with his back against the tree, a peaceful expression on his face. The monk placed his hand on Sefu's shoulder. When Sefu awoke, he asked, "Master, what has happened to me?" The monk looked at him with quiet joy. "You have remembered." Sefu sat up, touched the tree, and whispered, "I knew it was always here. I just forgot to stop." "Now you remember," said the monk, "and that remembrance will guide every swing of your axe, every step you take." Sefu pondered that. The next morning, he carried his axe once more, but this time, he walked to the grove, knelt before the tree, and bowed. Villagers watched, confused, curious. Sefu raised his axe and, with calm breath, made a single shallow stroke at a fallen branch on the forest floor. It cracked and fell away. He carried it to his humble home. No dramatic pile of timber, just enough for one family's hearth. From then on, Sefu's work became prayer, each swing thoughtful, each log chosen, each task attended with full presence. He chopped no more than needed, and only when necessary. He lived simply, richly. People began to notice. The neighbors spoke of the stillness around his home, the humming quiet of gratitude. Some came to ask him how he found peace. He guided them to the ancient grove, invited them to sit. He never lectured. He only asked, "Do you hear the world's breath? Do you feel your own?" And in sitting, they heard, and in feeling, they remembered, as he had remembered, that stillness is not absence, but home. The bell rang, and everything stilled. In the meditation hall, the air was soft with incense, and the light entered in long, warm lines through the papered windows. Outside, wind moved through the pine trees like breath, and inside, 30 people sat still, upright, present. Among them was Ren, sitting for the 43rd consecutive morning, his legs numb, his mind full. He had come to the monastery with questions, too many to name, too old to track. Some were practical. What should I do next? Why can't I sleep? How do I stop the noise in my mind? Some were existential. What is enough? Is there a right way to live? Some were ancient. Who am I beneath it all? Ren had always been a seeker. He devoured books on philosophy and spirituality, kept journals of ideas and theories. He'd asked therapists and teachers, lovers and strangers, but the answers he received only opened more questions. The deeper he searched, the less solid anything seemed. So, he came here. He hoped monks, men and women who had dedicated their lives to silence and simplicity might finally have something solid to offer, a teaching, a path, an answer. Instead, they taught him to sit, to walk, to breathe, and in that, they taught him nothing, at least nothing he could quote, explain, or package. This infuriated him. In the first weeks, he stayed up late scribbling in his notebook, writing pages of confusion, reflections, resentment. Why won't they answer anything? Why does no one tell me what's right? How can I be sure of anything at all? He confronted Master Keto one evening after dinner, his tone sharp with exhaustion. Why does no one here answer the real questions? Master Keto placed his bowl down and smiled. Because questions are not problems to solve. They are doors. Doors to what presence? The monk said. If you don't rush through. Ren walked away, frustrated, but the words followed him. Doors. Presence. If you don't rush through. He began to sit differently, not to escape the questions, but to befriend them. He started noticing their timing. Some came in the dark when fear was loudest. Others arrived in nature under trees, near rivers. When the world was whispering, he stopped trying to answer them all. He started asking differently. Instead of, "What is my purpose?" he asked, "What feels alive in me now?" Instead of, "What should I do with my life?" he asked, "What does this moment ask of me one evening?" While sweeping leaves from the stone garden, a novice named Mira approached. "You always look like you're searching," she said gently. Ren laughed, a little embarrassed. "I guess I am. May I tell you something my teacher told me?" Mira offered. "Please," he said. "Some questions only dissolve when you outgrow them." Ren paused. "What does that mean?" Mira smiled. "Maybe you'll know, when you stop needing to." She walked away. He stood there, broom in hand, heart open in a strange, quiet way. He kept sweeping, and something inside began to loosen. Weeks later, during walking meditation, a gentle rain began to fall. The line of practitioners continued slowly, each step a meditation. Rain dotted their shoulders, their sleeves, their shaved heads. Ren felt a drop slide down his neck, but he didn't flinch. He smiled. The question came again, one of the old ones. Why are we here but now? It didn't feel sharp. It felt soft, like an old friend visiting. He whispered back. Not an answer, but a breath. And that was enough. Back in the meditation hall, as the bell rang again, Ren remained on his cushion long after others had left. He sat, eyes closed, listening to the silence inside and out. The questions returned, as they always would, but this time, he welcomed them. He did not try to fix or frame them. He simply bowed to each one and whispered, "You may stay," because now, he knew. There are questions that are not meant to be answered. They are meant to be lived, to be carried gently, like a candle through the dark, to keep the heart open, to keep us soft, to keep us awake. The morning sun had just begun to stretch across the stone floor of the dining hall when Emiko, a volunteer at the monastery, placed the last bowl of porridge onto the tray. The kitchen was quiet now, steam rising from pots. The only sound of faint dripping from the bamboo faucet outside. She took a breath, then another, and realized something she had just cooked for 30 people without rushing, without checking the clock, without the usual knot of tension in her chest. She had done it all, and it had felt easy, not lazy, not passive, but effortless. That morning, she remembered something she'd read weeks earlier in the monastery library. Wu Wei is not inaction. It is action without force. At the time, she didn't fully understand. She had always been taught that effort was the engine of worth, that to be good, to be valuable, you must try harder, push more, do something. But here, In the quiet rhythm of shared living, she had begun to see something else, that when the mind is still and the heart is steady, actions flow without strain, not from trying, but from being. The lesson became clearer one afternoon during gardening. A group had gathered to transplant lettuce from small pots into the ground. Emiko, used to managing projects in her old corporate job, immediately began organizing the process, assigning rows, offering efficiency tips, trying to help. Then Master Ritsu arrived. He didn't stop her. He simply knelt, placed his hands in the soil, and began, slowly, deliberately, not rushing, not leading, simply moving with the earth. The others began to follow, not her system, but his stillness. Emiko sat back, watched, and something inside her softened. Later that day, she approached Master Ritsu and asked, "How do you move like that? Like you're not trying?" He smiled. "I don't stop to think what should be done. I listen, and then I let the moment decide." She frowned. "So, you don't plan?" "I prepare," he said, "but I do not push." She didn't answer, but the words stayed with her. That night, she dreamt she was swimming in a river. At first, she fought the current, arms flailing, but then she let go, floated, and in the letting go, she moved farther, faster, smoother than before. She woke up and whispered the words, "Let go to go." Mai. In the following weeks, Emiko began to experiment. She stopped interrupting silence with answers. She let conversations unfold. Instead of steering them, she walked without music, cooked without recipes, listened without preparing her reply. And life began to open, not with dramatic change, but with quiet joy. She noticed the sparkle of light on a spoon, the rhythm of breath while scrubbing a bowl, the way the bamboo creaked when the wind passed through. She was no longer doing to get somewhere. She was simply being. And from that being came the most honest action she'd ever known. Wu Wei, she realized, was not about doing nothing. It was about doing without forcing. It was the way water carved canyons without rush, without ambition, but with presence. She remembered Master Ritsu again. "Even a tree grows," he had said, without needing to think about how. One day, a young visitor at the monastery, tired from travel and full of questions, asked her, "Don't you get bored just doing chores all day?" Emiko smiled. She handed him a cup of tea and said, "I used to chase meaning. Now I sip it." The city never slept, even at 3 a.m. Lights blinked from apartment windows. Streetcars hissed along their tracks, and somewhere, always, the low hum of a television filled an otherwise silent room. For Ayla, this was normal. Noise was home. She lived on the 31st floor of a glass tower in the heart of downtown. Every morning, she woke to the sound of alarms her own, and those from a dozen devices scattered around the city. Her morning routine was precise coffee, emails, a scroll through headlines, a checklist of calendar reminders. Then she dressed in black, slipped on heels, and became efficient. Efficient, but not present. She moved like a shadow in a fast-moving crowd. The crosswalks blinked, the subways groaned, the crowds pressed forward. Ayla kept pace, But inside, something drifted further and further from her reach. She didn't know what to call it, only that it used to exist. Moments of stillness, joy, wonder. Now, all she felt was full. Too full. Her inbox, her mind, her apartment, her days, everything overfed and underfelt. One evening, after a presentation that left her hoarse and a dinner meeting that left her hollow, she walked home instead of taking a cab. It was raining, not hard, just enough to make the city shine. She walked without direction, turning corners, watching lights flicker on puddles. And then, at a narrow side street lined with bookstores and shuttered cafes, she heard something unexpected. Silence. Not total silence, but a stillness, a lack of urgency. She paused beneath a flickering street lamp, and in that pause, she heard it. Her breath, shallow, tight, almost foreign. How long had it been since she'd noticed it? She placed a hand on her chest, closed her eyes, and for the first time in what felt like years, she simply stood still. No purpose, no movement, just being. That moment broke something open. The next day, she skipped the morning headlines and sat by her window instead. She watched a pigeon walk the ledge, watched the clouds drift westward, watched the city blink awake and remain still. She began waking earlier, not for work, but for quiet. She lit a candle, sat cross-legged on the floor. No mantra, no plan, just breath. At first, it was hard. Her mind screamed. Her body fidgeted. But beneath the noise, a softness waited, and the more she returned to it, the more it returned to her. Ayla began to see the split. The city moved in one rhythm, her soul in another. The emails were fast. Her heart wanted slow. The meetings were loud. Her spirit craved silence. It wasn't that one was wrong. It was that they had drifted too far apart, and mindfulness soft. Persistent became her bridge. She started small. She walked to work without headphones, ate lunch without her phone, breathed between meetings, listened without planning her reply. In these tiny pauses, life returned. A barista's smile, a child's laugh, the weight of sunlight on her desk. None of it new, but now, finally, seen. And people noticed. You're calmer. One colleague said, "Something's different about you," said another. She didn't explain. How could she describe the shift from noise to noticing, from pace to presence? One night, watching the skyline from her apartment, Ayla wrote in her journal, "The city isn't the enemy, but I forgot I had a choice in how I move through it." And so, she chose not to flee, not to fight, but to flow, with breath, with grace, with the stillness that waited beneath every horn, every siren, every flashing light. The bus was late again. Min checked his watch, then checked it again, though he knew the numbers wouldn't change. It was 7:42 a.m., and the morning crowd around the bus stop was already growing restless. Someone sighed loudly. A man shook his head and muttered under his breath. A woman tapped her phone furiously. Min felt the edge of irritation crawl up his spine. He had an early meeting. His notes weren't ready. And now, the bus, the one thing outside his control, was also failing him. He exhaled. Then, perhaps out of frustration, or simply resignation, he looked up from his phone and gazed around. And for the first time in months, he saw the sky. It wasn't dramatic, just a pale morning blue, stitched with the thinnest clouds. But it was there, expansive, quiet. Watching them all, Min blinked. Something shifted. He didn't know it then, but that moment would be the beginning of a small revolution. Not the kind that uproots cities, but the kind that reorients the soul. Min was a designer. Deadlines, revisions, feedback loops. His world was built on urgency. Every moment not spent doing was, in his mind, a moment wasted. Even waiting at the bus stop had a purpose to get somewhere. But now, as he stood in that widening circle of irritation, he found himself strangely still. The crowd remained. The bus remained absent. But he wasn't tensing anymore. Instead, he felt his feet touch the pavement. He noticed the sound of wind rustling through the dried leaves. He noticed his breath fast, then slower. The world hadn't changed, but he had started watching. The next day, he came earlier, not because he expected the bus to be late again, but because he wanted to wait, not to do emails, not to scroll headlines, but to observe. It became a kind of practice. Each morning, he would arrive 10 minutes early, stand quietly at the bus stop, and notice. Some days, it was the sound of footsteps, the rhythm of shoes against sidewalk. Other days, the expressions on people's faces: worry, distraction, sometimes joy. He didn't judge. He just watched and breathed. One morning, a small boy stood beside him, holding a woman's hand. The boy looked up and smiled. Min smiled back. That was all. But it stayed with him the entire day. He started calling it bus stop meditation. It wasn't formal. There was no posture, no mantra, just presence. He began to realize how much life he'd missed in the spaces in between. The walk between home and the station. The minutes waiting for a page to load. The red lights in traffic. He used to fill those gaps with noise checking, comparing, planning. But now, he leaned into them, let them stretch, let them breathe, and in doing so, he began to breathe too. It wasn't always peaceful. Some days, he still felt impatient. Some mornings, he forgot. He'd catch himself checking his phone out of habit, tension knotting his shoulders. But the difference now was awareness. He noticed the impatience. He watched the knot, and slowly, it loosened. A month later, Min missed his bus entirely. Not because he was late, but because he was present. He had been watching a bird hop along the curb, its movements erratic but full of focus. He watched as it pecked at a crumb, tilted its head, then took flight. By the time he looked up, the bus doors were closing. He didn't curse. He smiled and waited for the next one. He began bringing this slowness into other parts of his life. He answered emails with attention. He listened to colleagues without formulating responses in his head. He ate lunch without a screen, and surprisingly, he felt more efficient, not less, more creative, not drained. He realized that stillness wasn't the opposite of productivity. It was its foundation. The one morning, the usual crowd gathered again at the stop. The bus was, once more, late. People shifted, sighed, complained. Min stood, quiet. A young woman beside him huffed and said, "This city's always behind." Min turned and smiled gently. "Or maybe we're always ahead." She looked at him, confused. He said nothing more, just let the silence speak. The alarm rang at 4:30, sharp, like always. Mai stirred in the darkness, the room still heavy with sleep. In the narrow space of their rented apartment, her daughter Lynn was curled under a thin blanket, breathing softly. Mai didn't hit snooze. She never did. There wasn't time for luxury, not when every minute was borrowed from somewhere else. She sat up, stretched silently, and slipped into the kitchen. The light above the stove flickered once, then steadied. She reached for the rice cooker, then the lunch boxes. Quiet hands, practiced motions, boiled eggs, stir-fried vegetables, a few slices of apple, neatly arranged. By 5:10 breakfast was ready. By 5:20 she was dressed. By 5:30 she woke Lynn with a kiss. Her smile came instinctively, though her body ached. "Good morning. Konyu." Lynn rubbed her eyes. "Mommy, is it still dark?" "Yes," Mai whispered, "but we bring our own light. Remember?" Lynn smiled sleepily and nodded. Mai was a single mother. Her husband had left shortly after Lynn turned 2. When money ran thin and silence ran thicker, she never heard from him again. No letters, no support. At first, she cried every night. But then, she stopped. Not because the pain left, but because the responsibilities grew louder than the grief. Rent, school, food, smiles. She couldn't afford to fall, so she stood. And in standing, she discovered a strange kind of peace. Not loud, not triumphant, but quiet, resilient. The kind of peace born from knowing that every morning she rose was an act of love. Mai worked 2 jobs. Morning shift at a cafe near the bus station. Evening shift cleaning offices downtown. In between. She took Lynn to school, helped with homework, and cooked dinner. There were days when she walked 15 blocks instead of paying for the bus, just to save enough for Lynn's new shoes. Days when she skipped lunch so Lynn could have an extra carton of milk. And still, she smiled at strangers, at coworkers, at the world, because smiling, she believed, was a form of offering. Even when life gave her little, she gave what she could. And every morning, when she said goodbye to Lynn outside the school gate, she knelt and whispered, "Live with kindness today. Con, even if the world forgets to be kind back." One morning, the cafe was unusually busy. Machines steamed, orders stacked. The line curved out the door. A customer spilled coffee on the counter, cursed under his breath. Mai rushed forward, cloth in hand. "I'll clean it right away." "Sir?" He didn't thank her. She smiled anyway. Later, a coworker asked, "Why are you always so nice to people who don't deserve it?" Mai paused, then replied softly, Because my daughter is watching. Home. Lynn had begun writing little notes and leaving them for Mai to find. I love your laugh. Mommy, you make the best rice. Even the moon would be jealous of your smile. Mai kept them all tucked into her wallet, hidden in coat pockets, slipped between pages of her worn notebook. They were her silent mantras. On bad days, she'd pull one out and breathe, and remember why she kept going. One evening, after her cleaning shift, she stood on the bus, swaying with exhaustion. An old man beside her dropped his grocery bag. Apples rolled across the aisle. Others looked away. Mai bent down, gathered them gently, placed them back into his bag. The man said nothing, just looked at her, eyes glistening. She smiled and nodded, then turned back to the window. Lynn once asked her, "Is it hard being happy when you're tired?" Mommy Mai hugged her. "I'm not always happy, but I try to stay soft like your hugs." Lynn asked, "Exactly." Hinan. In her quiet way, Mai practiced a kind of everyday dharma. She didn't chant sutras, she didn't read scriptures, but she lived them. In each act of compassion, each moment of patience, each quiet surrender. And that, perhaps, was the truest kind of practice. It began with a single step, not rushed, not distracted, just one conscious movement of the foot, heel touching the earth, then the ball, then the toes. Min had been practicing walking meditation at the temple courtyard for weeks. At first, it felt foreign, artificial. Why walk so slowly? What purpose did it serve? But the teacher had simply smiled and said, "It is not about where you're going. It's about arriving here." Now, with each step, at first, Min tried to focus hard, counting steps, repeating mantras, correcting posture. But the more he tried, the less he felt. Until one afternoon, a breeze brushed his cheek as he stepped, and in that exact moment, he felt alive. Not because something extraordinary had happened, but because nothing had distracted him from the ordinary. From then on, walking became his practice, not just at the temple, but everywhere, across the office hallway, to the corner market, from his bedroom to the kitchen. He stopped rushing, stopped walking as if he was late to his own life. Instead, he walked as if the ground beneath him was sacred, as if each step whispered, "You are here." The city didn't slow down for him. Of course, cars still honked, people still pushed past, deadlines still loomed, but inside, something shifted, while others rushed to escape the moment. Min had begun to walk into it. He realized that peace wasn't a place. It was a pace. One evening, while crossing the crowded station, a man bumped into him. Hard. The man didn't apologize, just kept walking. Min felt anger rise. His body tightened, but then he paused, breathed, felt the soles of his feet touch the ground again, and in that breath, the anger dissolved, not because it vanished, but because he didn't feed it. He just stepped through it. He remembered something a monk once said: mindfulness is not avoiding the world. It's walking gently through it. And so Min walked gently, through sorrow, through joy, through chaos and stillness. Each step, a prayer. One weekend, he visited his childhood village. The roads were narrower, the air cleaner. He walked along a trail that once led to his grandmother's house. She used to wait by the gate, smile wide, arms open. She was gone now, but as Min walked, memories rose of her holding his hand, of her telling stories about Buddha under starlit skies. He stopped, closed his eyes, and whispered, Ba, Kanjang Jinhu Ba Jan De. A leaf floated down and landed near his foot. He smiled. Back in the city, Min joined a small group that practiced walking meditation in public parks. They moved in silence, barefoot in the grass. Children sometimes laughed at them. Joggers looked puzzled. But none of that mattered. Each person in the group carried their own story, their own grief, their own hope. And yet, in each step, they shared one truth: I am here. Sometimes, during walks, Min remembered a Zen tale his teacher once told. A student asked the master, How do I reach enlightenment? The master replied. Walk, the student asked. What do I do after enlightenment? The master replied. Walk. Min never forgot that, because walking, he realized, wasn't just movement. It was a returning to breath, to self, to now. And so, the journey winds to stillness, through the breath of a tired mother, the pause at a bus stop, the silent path of a barefoot walk we return, again and again, to what we had never truly left this moment. Throughout this shared unfolding, we've walked beside those who carried sorrow like stones in their chest, who endured without recognition, who smiled through weariness, and who amidst all that noise chose stillness. Not the stillness of escape, but the stillness of presence. From the quiet grace of a tea ceremony to the subtle wisdom in a child's gaze, we've witnessed that mindfulness isn't reserved for mountaintops or monasteries. It breathes between dishes washed, in steps taken to work, in soft replies when the world expects sharpness. The Dharma lives in the street as it does in sutras, in the city's siren as in the monk's bell. To live mindfully isn't to withdraw from life, but to step into it fully, with eyes open, breath deep, heart soft. To choose kindness, again and again, even when no one watches. To pause, to see, to smile, not because all is perfect, but because we've touched what is real. As this journey concludes, the invitation remains. Breathe. Look around you. Feel your feet. You don't need to go elsewhere. Peace is not ahead. It is underneath, inside, and always here. If this story touched a quiet place within you, we invite you to to let it ripple forward. Like, comment with your reflections, and subscribe for more gentle offerings from the heart of practice. And in our next video, we will journey deeper into how silence can become our greatest teacher in the noisiest seasons of life. Until then, walk softly and arrive fully here, now.